Right, let's kick off. So, well, thanks everyone for joining, and especially Em and Justin. Now, Justin, we will explain a little bit more that that's not a virtual avatar. It is your effort at Movember, and we'll put a link in for donations as well. But really, this was a bit of a follow-up from the breakfast that we had, the industry breakfast we had up in Brisbane, and it turned out to be like a great conversation around your story at Energy Queensland and how you sort of got the business case over the line. I thought, look, it'd be great to sort of share with the broader community. So, wanted to introduce Justin, Advanced Analytics Manager at Energy Queensland. Will take us through really a bit of the approach around proving the value of, I suppose, scaling analytic systems and getting the organizational buy-in, and some of the challenges you faced and the success that's come off it. And Emily Kuchikalic, who's heading up our sort of communications and marketing. So, but she's a much better host and MC than I am. So, Emma, I'm going to hand over to you. You can start grilling Justin. For people who have joined online, there's a link in the chat for the Movember. So we are spruiking that. The other thing is please start with your questions as soon as you feel comfortable. Start firing them. That's what made the breakfast event in person so successful. So yeah, Em, over to yourself and Justin.
Thanks, Haj, and welcome everyone. Yeah, I think I got to ask one question in totality last time, so we'll see how many I get in this time, Justin. Let's start broad and kind of set the picture a little bit. Queensland in general is really at the forefront of the energy transition, and Energy Queensland is obviously one of the big providers in that space. What are some of the things that you and your team are facing when it comes to looking at data and scaling it to support the transition?
Yeah, good question. So I think, as is probably the same around the country at the moment, the big thing that seems to be a challenge when it comes to data and analytics is the consumer energy resources bit, which is obviously a key enabler of that energy transition, and also, making or thinking about customer choice and what are the options moving forward to give customers more control over their energy, but also, manage the distribution network to sort of provide mutually beneficial outcomes for that transition state. So, yeah, you can imagine, with consumer energy resources comes a whole volume of new data that we have to work with from an analytics perspective to understand it, and then obviously, as we say, develop new products and services for the network and to enable customer choice. So that's probably one of the biggest things. So that could be things like, obviously rooftop solar is a big one in particularly Queensland, but across the country as well. We've got batteries are the new biggest ticket item at the moment, both network batteries, obviously going out on the network to try and manage network constraints, but also in customer installations as well. So you could imagine a whole raft of new data sets that we've never seen before coming from these devices out in the network. Electric vehicles is another big one. So still got sort of moderately low levels of penetration of electric vehicles, but we know that's coming. It's going to be the next big thing. So need to be prepared for that, understand how, clusters of electric vehicles charging on lower levels of our distribution network will impact those things. And then that obviously informs how we plan for those, eventualities for the future, but also, offer customer options as well, because we know that's coming. So we want to encourage and support the adoption of electric vehicles and things like that, whilst at the same time managing the network. There's always been in Queensland in particular a lot of controlled loads as well. So things like hot water heaters, air conditioners, things like that. So they're just one example of something where the proliferation of these consumer energy resources across the state is just creating whole new data ecosystems that didn't exist before. So it's new data volume. It's also, talk about the velocity of data coming in. So a lot of these things are IoT devices. So that poses new challenges in terms of, from a technical perspective, security, cyber security, etc. But also just managing the influx of data and, certain certain analytics might be required in like near real time or real time. That's a relatively new thing as well. I know on the engineering side of the world, that's not new, but it's just the sheer volume and scale of that data coming in at that volume that we're having to deal with now. That's probably the big one. Some of the things that are relatively recent initiatives that have been released publicly are pilots and trials that are going on, as well as, you know, rollouts basically now of, as I said before, network batteries, so battery energy storage systems on the network, but also local renewable energy zones. So trialing different ways that we can understand and help customers with that sort of increased adoption of consumer energy resources out there to enable that transition.
And you started your data journey with Ignite a couple of years ago, you know, at a specific time in the NEM. And can you tell us a little bit about that, and then how that's brought you to today to be able to look at all of those use cases you've just talked about? And then the third part of that question is, what are some of the use cases you're working on? So a little bit about the journey to get there and what you put in place to enable you to start looking at some of the more, I guess, exciting opportunities that are presenting themselves as part of the transition.
Yeah, good question. So I guess the initial driver for us was around the, I guess, what we call the energy market interval meter reading data. So in the market, this is not unique to Queensland at all. There's been a transition over a number of years towards adopting interval read meters. So we went from majority of our connections out on the network going from, you know, having quarterly read metering, where we take a meter reading once and then we come back in 3 months' time and do another one, and we know the total energy used over that period, through to now a adoption of digital metering across the state. And so therefore, that's due to things like the power of choice reforms in the market, more broadly in the market. And then on top of that, we went from 30-minute settlements, also in the market, to 5-minute settlements. So there was two things there with even the data that we get through from our sort of as part of the market from metering installations out on the connection points has gone from a reading every 3 months to you know, a reading every 5 minutes that we get a day behind is sort of where we are now. And that's actually, you know, I think when we first approached Ignite, we were already starting to struggle then on the analytics side of our business in terms of building analytics capability just with that single data set alone. Our systems and processes that we had set up were never designed to deal with that scale of, or that volume of data. So we needed to fundamentally change how we architected solutions to do that. And that was also our first foray from a data science or advanced analytics platform perspective of transitioning or moving over into taking advantage of the cloud capabilities and modern data platforms that now exist. Previously, we were sort of in-house on, I guess you'd call them more traditional analytics architecture that just couldn't scale to that volume of data. So that was our key first. It was sort of focused around the interval meter data, and we had a backlog of use cases along with some immediate ones that we needed to solve for purely around that data set. So the big one is our strategic forecasting. So we work closely with the strategic forecasting team in the business, who are charged with you know, building our demand and energy forecasts for different levels of our network. We have also worked with the Ergon retail forecasting team in the past as well. They've got more needs around the trading and energy use side of things from a retail perspective. But yeah, in terms of strategic forecasting, that was sort of where we could add a lot of value with this particular data set, right through from applications in terms of understanding the underlying or native demand out on customer connections. For those who aren't aware, like a lot of the readings that come through from the market interval data is all net readings, which means if a connection has, say, for example, solar PV connected on it, we only see the net generation back to the network or to the customer premises. We don't see the gross generation and gross consumption separately. So from a forecasting perspective, they need to understand what that differential is. So building models, based around sunlight and things like that. It's critical to have this data set and then models running over the top of it to predict those things, which then feed into the actual energy forecast themselves. So there's multiple different forecasting products that rely on the metadata analytics solution that are built off the top of it. So they were immediate, and we're continuing to refine those to this day with the forecasting team. We also had, as I said before, the electric vehicle sort of uptake was another use case where we do a lot of work with our future network strategy team, and they have a electric vehicle strategy and some tactics around how we're managing or preparing for increased adoption of electric vehicles. And one of the tactics in that strategy is to understand or get advanced warning of where we might see clusters of electric vehicles charging at low voltage areas on our network. So think about, a local suburban area where there might be whatever driver it might be, like the demographics of that area, for example, might be where we see advanced adoption of electric vehicles. And if they're all charging on the same low voltage distribution transformer, for example, that would be interesting for us to get advanced warning of, so that it can help us plan for the future. So that was another use case straight off the bat. We've also got one that we're working on now. We involve the network pricing team. So they're the team who have the remit to set the tariff offerings and network charges across the state. And so they're very interested in understanding at different tariffs, for example, what are the energy usages behaviours, so that they can understand how to develop new tariff offerings for customers that help support the long-term strategies of the business as well. So all of those, even just those few examples there, are use cases that all require this one single data set, but heavily sort of strategic aligned for that future direction leading into that energy transition.
So how did you go about putting all those kind of pieces in place? Like, you started to work with Ignite to establish that platform from which you could grow from, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that we did, which was really useful actually, was the proof of value phase. So, and then they're not my words, that was Ignite's idea for us to help literally prove the value of the new solution. So I'm sure I'm not alone in any investment in new technologies, and new ways of working requires business justification and a good return on investment. And sometimes that's challenging, particularly with analytics projects, because it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. How do you prove the value before you've actually done the work? So so the proof of value was a really good activity where we got together, we leveraged the experience of Ignite in working with this particular data set in the market, and then our experience of working with the business, and we sort of knew what the analytics requirements were from the business perspective. So we brought the two together and were able to very rapidly develop a working prototype where we could actually look at what would it actually take us to do this for real, and what are the actual costs, and what's the value generated from doing it with the business. So I think that process took us collectively, with a dedicated focus, less than 6 weeks from sort of start to finish, where we were able to demonstrate that full gamut of capability back to our executives, and that was the proof of value that then led into the business case to go and establish the new platform capabilities.
And over that 6 weeks, how hard was it to get kind of the backing of the business people you're working with? Because presumably over 6 weeks you're working with all the different areas that needed, or you thought needed, this support.
Yeah, good question. So I think we had already been working with a number of the business areas. So the key one there was, as I mentioned before, like strategic forecasting team, network pricing team. So it was essential they were involved. There's also a whole range of other parts of the business and use cases that we know need this capability. So yeah, it was a little bit more difficult to go out in a proof of value phase and engage with all of those areas in the short amount of time. But we actually did try to incorporate that in as much as we could. So we could at least identify as many of the, I guess, the known knowns, analytical needs that existed out there within the in the confines of the proof of value, and then, as I said, actually deliver a working prototype with the teams that we were already working with anyway, and they were very happy to lean in and help us with that, because obviously it's in their interest. They need this capability as well. So that was good, yeah. And it was hard work. So I won't. It was a very intense 6 weeks. Yeah.
Justin, one of the I might jump in with a question there. One of the other big parts you had to prove, or sort of at least have a good idea of, was the architecture. And I know with Energy Queensland, data sovereignty and critical infrastructure, that was a big deal. So it wasn't just use cases and a working prototype. It was also understanding what it's going to take to make this into I suppose, a scalable and robust solution. Yeah, what were some of the things that you learned through that process? I mean, I know we learned a lot, but what were some of the things that sort of come to mind to you? Because again, it was a 5-6 week period, which was quite intense.
Yeah, no, good call out, and yeah, probably take this opportunity to say it's not just us. So it wasn't just us and the analytics team and the business teams who were consuming that. There were a lot of other areas of our digital division that were involved to make this happen as well. So right from our cloud enablement team, and as I said, this was our first foray into using the cloud environments. So, and as you say, Harj, that was brought with it a new level of scrutiny from our cybersecurity teams as well, around really understanding what this is, because it was new. That was another level of complexity. We were sort of taking to quote one of my previous bosses, taking the scooter down the dirt road for the first time, using a real world use case to do that, to try and understand what some of these issues are, rather than, I guess, the flip side of that is we could try and understand what all the risks and considerations were before doing anything. And that's where we've seen that becomes a very difficult way to progress an initiative, because you sort of get into that analysis paralysis, and before you know it, you haven't delivered any outcome. And you might have a plan that doesn't have a funding model to move forward. So yeah, so from that perspective, it was really good. We were working with our cloud team, our cybersecurity team, critical to engage them early. This is an ecosystem, or we have an ecosystem of platforms. So understanding all of those interplays. We also call out need to work closely with our integration team, digital integration team as well. Was part of that mix, and our enterprise data teams as well. So even things like information management, all of the data governance aspects, working through the use case. We still had to go and work with all of those areas to make it happen. So it was good for us, good learnings to understand also some of the previously unknown boundaries or responsibility boundaries between some of the different platforms as well. Is I guess a key learning that came from that. One of the other things that I think helped us make that work is we did have a little bit of a more informal than some of our traditional large scale projects, but an informal steering committee established, and we did have general managers from across those different groups sitting on the steerco, and we met weekly, facilitated by Ignite. I think that was very useful. Call out any challenges early in the process so that we could move forward.
And did that mean you had all these champions as you went through it, because they'd been through the whole process of building, or designing the solution?
Yeah, certainly the people that we work with, absolutely, they were very invested and keen in the outcome. As I said, they're some of the analysis that they need to do and the outputs that they need to build that feed into other processes then are sort of critically relying on this capability. So absolutely, we've still got key champions and users were some of those early adopters that were on the journey from the start.
And how did you go about skilling because presumably there were tons of new skills you had to bring in, both within your team and potentially expanded, because you're talking about forecasters and analysts across the business in different sections who presumably have their own models and ways of going about things and are running everything on Excel. How did you go about and didn't necessarily want to do it the way that maybe you were bringing it in? How have you gone about that side of building that sort of data focus and capability across the organisation?
Yeah, good question. So I would say it's an ongoing journey, and yeah, we do have, like, just recently we have gone through a bit of a a data literacy or data maturity exercise. We're refreshing our data strategy at the moment, and yeah, we do have like pockets of very mature capability that we work with, like within teams, and even sometimes individuals within teams. And then we've got other parts of the business that could be on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So it is, it is a bit of a challenge working with that within that spectrum, because part of our role is help, I guess, educate and upskill. The biggest, I think, way that we found works is through experience. So it is a challenge. Like, I know traditional methods of training, you might be go and develop a skill, go and learn, develop a skill. But we found that if you can't then immediately apply that to a real world business problem, it's something that it could be potentially wasted effort. So that was really good through this process, is we were actually learning, and we gave ourselves and the people we're working with leverage to learn as we were developing the actual thing that was going to be used. I think that's probably critical, and it was an upskilling, I think, required by everyone on the project, including us. As I said, it was our first foray into using new platforms, new capabilities, and in some ways, there's a lot of, there can be an easy entry pathway for the platform that we use. People who are familiar with SQL. And potentially with Excel, for example, the concept of a data table, all of that is still relevant, but it can also be a bit of a jump and quite technical. So it's an ongoing journey, and it is something that you really do need to consider up front, is who are the end users, how are they going to interact with this, and how do we collectively build capability to get the best value out of these modern platforms. It's not something where you can just transition if you haven't been, don't have the desire, or haven't been sort of doing that continuous improvement and keeping aware of the current trends in the industry, etc.
And then, because you've got these different skill sets, have you got people at kind of different levels within the system and what they can do? And have you set up an area for people to learn more and build, ideas? A lot of Ignite's clients talk about how they develop prototypes and then how they build that into production. Have you got that worked out yet?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say it definitely worked out. Still a work in progress. One good thing that we did do through this initial project is we did build into it an upskilling or a specific deliverable around our engagement, to make sure that we had our platform ops team involved in that process, and we actually focused on what would be required, because it is such a very different platform, or it was at the time, to what traditionally we had. There was a focus put on upskilling operations as well. So it's not one of these things where when you build something, it works, it's great, and then it's like throw over the fence and good luck sort of thing. It's actually a transition path to ensure that at the end of the day, and Ignite leave the building, we were self-sufficient, we could cut the cord, and we sort of have full autonomy over that support process now. We made sure that was built in to the actual part of the deliverables to get that transition path. So it wasn't just a hard sort of stop and a throw of materials over the fence. That was probably one key aspect. And the other thing is, more broadly now, just talking about analytics at EQL, we did also establish a analytics community of practice. So that's bringing together analysts from all across the business, and they don't necessarily have to be working directly with us, but it's more about a place where they can start sharing knowledge, experience, questions between themselves as practitioners, and hopefully have a presence there as well, so we can jump in if any questions arise that we can help with. There's probably multiple things going on there.
One of the questions that comes up a lot around modern data architectures or modern data platforms, whatever you want to call them, is do you take a platform first approach or a use case first approach, right? And it's a little bit hard, right? Because you go platform first, it's usually long-winded. It might take a long time before you actually start realizing value. Use cases, if you don't select the right use cases, you might miss the mark on the first instance. And it's sort of like, how do you justify the business case for that one use case that's going to suddenly build out a platform? The approach you took was, I suppose it was a little bit of have your cake and eat it, do use cases, but make sure the architecture and the platform scales, right? Because it's just literally clicked over how many million NMIs? 1.2 or something. So
yeah, we're officially over 1.2 now. Yep, at 5-minute intervals. Yep.
So was that, was that the circumstances of where you and your team were at that sort of forced you down that sort of use case architecture combo, or was it you had realized from previous attempts that going down a platform first approach or just a use case first approach is not going to work? Like, because it was quite a unique way of doing it, in a way of, can we answer both questions and deliver both at the same time? So what drives that thinking?
No, absolutely. Yeah, so well, partly it was, I guess, working with Ignite yourselves. We, to be honest, before we started on this journey, we were struggling a little bit with that. So we certainly had, I guess you'd call it the burning platform from an analytics perspective. And I just highlight too that I'm only here talking about the analytics component of this, not necessarily the operational systems that also run the same data. But from an analytics perspective, our current solution was broken, so that was sort of the immediate driver. We had to find a working solution that met the scale challenge, and then I think it was a bit of advice from yourselves, and when we looked into it, across the industry, I said, "Oh, this is going to work." We then, at the same time, it was like very minimal extra effort to tick off the broader needs. So that was something that just became evident when we sort of started scoping this out and said, "Oh, this is the way we need to tackle it." But it wasn't initially it wasn't a conscious decision. We were probably in that boat of struggling. How do we tackle this as well? So it was good. I think it worked out well to take that approach in hindsight.
And just jumping back to the, I suppose you called it upskilling. I think Em called it upskilling, and you've talked about sort of different users at different skill levels. There's a tendency with, I suppose, cloud-based architectures that you can switch things on and they'll work. But there is a variety of services available in those sort of architectures, and I think the actual effort required from a team point of view, in an upskilling point of view, can be underestimated. So, and you anticipated that pretty well, not just from an end user point of view, but also an operations point of view. What sort of drove your thinking around those sort of two equal important roles to make this successful?
Yeah. So that was a critical factor, and I think that's probably experience, and it may be, I'm guessing, may be different depending on the situation and maturity at different organisations. But where we were, as I said, it was probably the key thing was we knew this was very new, moving into the cloud systems at the time back then. We knew it was very new, so we just had experience working previously with a lot of our operations teams, which offer great support, but they just didn't have any of that experience working with these modern platforms. And so, guess empathise with that. It's a big jump, I guess, to be going in. So we were very conscious. We didn't just want to put in a new system that we knew the team didn't have any experience operating before, and just expect them to be able to understand what's going on like that. So that was a conscious decision going in. We knew the sort of existing skill level, so it would have been very different had we already been operating a number of cloud-based analytics platforms. Then we probably wouldn't have had that same concern at that time. But also the other thing is just shout out to any of the operations teams out there. Critical for the success of the sustainability of these solutions is having them on board and involved. But as you say, Harj, that's often a bit that's underlooked. So we were very aware of that and wanted to make sure that that didn't happen in this instance.
Just a reminder that there is an opportunity to open to ask Q&As in the Q&A piece. If you do have any questions for Justin or Harj, definitely not for me. I'll just refer to both of them if there's any. You talked about, Justin, proving value, and now you've got we're a couple of years, 2-3 years on since you started, and you're now building more use cases for different groups. How do you go about deciding which use case is going to be the next one off the rank, the next one to run with, or the next piece to build? And how do you measure the value of that particular piece? Do you prove it for each new use case?
Yeah, so we have tried to adopt elements of the approach with the proof of value to our, I guess, internal ways of working and service offerings. I will say it is still something that is emerging, and we have had a couple of internal, I guess, organisational reshuffles around that. So where we are today is working in a different work group. We're now sort of part of the enterprise data team, and we're reviewing that again. How do we make that more seamless, I guess, that approach, and more consistent across, obviously a lot of work happening across the business. So I wouldn't say it's perfect yet, but one thing that we did adopt for ourselves was, and it was sort of originally inspired by CRISP DM, so that the cross-industry standard process for data mining was the initial thing. And one thing that we found was a little bit lacking, probably goes a little bit to that, maturity piece, was the step one is always understand the business problem. And we found that we weren't, as an organisation, doing that very well. So we'd often get, solutions looking for problems. So we'd get people coming in saying, I want X to do this. And it's like, well, what problem are we trying to solve for first? And really go back and understand that, and then go, all right, how can we best solve that? So that was probably one thing, is how do we internally approach these with a little bit of discipline around a process, but we need to make it lightweight so that it's not, what's the right word? It doesn't put off people from going through the process. And so that was probably step one. In there, we have questions. We also like to, where we can, get general manager sponsorship for new use cases. So if we've got a new demand coming for advanced analytics services, we'd like to get a general manager sponsor involved in that process. Again, very lightweight. We know they've got a lot on their plate, but we'd like to get their sponsorship so that they have visibility of what's going on, and they've signed up to say, yes, this is aligned to one of our organisation's strategic areas of focus, so that we know we've got direct alignment through to our business strategies. That's sort of a key non-negotiable, and then we can work with the product owners within the relevant business unit to make sure they've got skin in the game as well, and they're contributing to the use case. So that's another one that's sort of like, again, non-negotiable, where it's like, this is a valuable thing, we need to do it, we want to help work on it together, but we need to have a bit of input from the business area, and that could be varied too, depending on what skills already exist out there. And so it could be contribution, could be from, offering subject matter expertise on the problem as part of our, transient team that we form up, right through to, as I said, with a strategic forecasting team, they've got data science expertise in their team, so they would actually contribute the modelling aspects in those use cases. So that's probably two things: contribution from the business, so they've got skin in the game, and then, as I said, general manager sponsorship, make sure we're aligned to strategic area of focus. And there's some other prioritization things in there that we're working through and refining at the moment as well. In terms of I think the second part of the question was around value. How do we value these things? Yeah, that's something that I think we probably need to do a little bit better. So at the moment, I guess value is have we met our success criteria that were agreed up front through that discovery process? At the end, can we say, yep, we've hit our milestones and we've met our success criteria or otherwise? And if we haven't, maybe that's a record or understand the learnings of that process while we didn't for future. But we don't necessarily have I'd say a robust way of measuring across that ecosystem that we talked about before of people involved. So that's something that I think, yeah, we could probably give a bit more thought to, and I think would be needed for future projects that then demonstrate the value. Like it's sort of, again, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg type thing. How do you progress more through to understand what we've done to date? How much effort did that take us with different skill sets through different service offerings? Because every use case is unique in that regard. Yeah, that's something that we've been talking about recently as to can we get some quantitative measures that would help us say the conclusion of a incubation use case. We can go back and say, oh, yep, we can give a number almost to the value, and that takes into account the full scope of everyone and all of the different capabilities that were involved, not just the success criteria. But it's still a work in progress on that one. Happy to hear if there's other views on that, or yeah, if anyone's got advice, by the way, on that one, because I think that's yeah.
One of the challenges
one
with
that we're tackling.
I think one of the challenges with the value question is are you willing to put your hand on your heart and follow through with it? So we've started to have to use a little bit of like the star symbols, like Google rating type thing of, rather than putting an actual dollar value on it, can you put a bit of a magnitude to it? So it takes out a bit of the heat out of the equation of, thou shalt retrieve $1 million or something through improved business processes, which is not always the case with sort of the analytics use cases. One of the questions that come through, and this might be a question around, we've talked about the modern data architecture, but the choices you made, and it's, how did you handle the transition from 3-month to 5-minute intervals from a data processing perspective? And I suppose in a way that was probably the big driver around the architecture or the platform choices you made. Can you elaborate a bit more on the direction you took?
Yeah, sure. So we knew that was coming, but yeah, when we went live with the first with the platform, that was just prior, for those who are familiar with the 5-minute settlement changes in the market in Australia. That was we went live just before that was actually introduced. So at the time we went live, we actually only had most sites that were interval read were 30-minute, and then we did have some of the larger sites at 15-minute intervals. But it was after we went live that 5-minute settlement was introduced. So we knew that was coming, though. That had been on the roadmap for quite some time. So that was a key design consideration, as you say, Haj, from an architectural perspective. We know we need to scale, or the solution needed to be able to scale to handle that. We couldn't come back in a year's time and then have to re-architect or redesign it when we knew that was coming. So that was a key choice, and that was where we effectively learnt all about Apache Spark and all of the goodness that goes along with scalable compute. But also there was some design choices there around how to architect the solution to make sure that it was running in sort of a Spark native, I won't get too technical, but a Spark native way, so that really, going into the future at this stage, and it's probably a little bit more nuanced than this, we found in reality, but the idea is that we can just through a release now, if we need to, as the data volume grows, we can just increase our compute capacity effectively at the push of a button. It's not actually that simple, but well, for the purposes of this, say it's that simple. And then we keep going. So that's how it scales. yeah, so it was really around understanding that was coming, and then adopting, first learning about, then adopting the Spark framework, and obviously the platform that's built around that to build a solution in.
And when we sort of first set the platform up, because we sort of set it up as a data science platform for essentially, I suppose, the data scientists, the analysts in the business, teams like yourselves, and in a way it was to exploit the data that was becoming available. With the recent sort of, I suppose, the Gen AI themes that are coming through, are you is there a change from the end users, as in the types of people interacting with these platforms, or is the demand changing, that it's more from, I suppose, frontline staff, the executives who are asking for more of these sort of advanced analytics use cases, as opposed to the data scientists coming up with them? Have you seen that shift?
Yeah, so we get demands from all different levels, types, roles in the organisation. So yeah, I'm just trying to think. I don't know if I've observed a specific change in that, other than, yeah, obviously with the release of the large language models, that has generated a lot of hype in the industry, as we all know, and yeah, so we're seeing increased demand for that. We do have very closely with another part of our business, the emerging technologies team, who's also sort of grappling with that. So we're trying to understand at the moment, the organisation, we're trying to understand the risks and valuation sort of aspects and prioritisation aspects with a lot of those types of use cases. Certainly the demand's there for it, but I find that it's a challenge for us going through the discovery process. Sometimes it can be a solution looking for a problem. So you've got to try and politely understand what is someone who is wanting a particular solution for a particular driver, but when we actually look into it, it might be a business problem that could be better served by a different outcome, for example. And navigating that is challenging when you've got so much demand coming in. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, Harj, but I haven't noticed any particular change, other than, yes, a lot of demand for these services is there, ever present in the business. Yeah, from all levels, from executives right down to the management and users out in the business.
I was just going to say, Harj, if you're seeing that kind of growth in demand, Justin, is it getting easier to get funding for projects in the data space within your organisation?
That's something that we're working through. So yeah, it's not, again, the model about how we operate with that could be different in different companies. So it's not always necessarily about funding. It could be about resourcing or prioritisation or capacity, those sorts of things. So there's often different ways you can tackle those problems. So yeah, it's something that I think one of the biggest challenges that we've got today is more around prioritising and figuring out which of the use cases goes first, when you've got so many that are all strategically aligned and all potentially have different, slightly different, levers on the prioritisation framework, but they can all come out very similarly. That's quite a challenge at the moment.
Good. Justin, I'm conscious of time, so I think we're over already. I can't believe it's gone so quick. Justin, before we sort of plug the Movember link again, one question from me. So I always like this one. Knowing what you know now, if you go back a few years, is there anything you would? So what's the one thing that you would say I wouldn't change, and maybe the one thing you would do differently?
Yeah, good question. So I think one thing that I wouldn't change would be the proof of value and that considered approach to how that was tackled at the start to prove the value. I think was turned out to be very wise decision on how to progress this to get an outcome or deliver an outcome at the end. So that was quite important. What would we do again? So I think no, where we are today, and it's probably a little bit nuanced because it's a bit like hindsight. But I think as we talked about before, we did involve our operations support team and had a conscious effort of upskilling that area. But I think maybe having a little bit more, I don't say marketing, but a little bit more demonstration of that value at higher levels of the organisation to get buy-in at that level across the board would be good, more understanding. So yeah, one of the things is that that we have found is that we were able to deliver a great outcome at a comparatively, I'd say, lower cost than probably what was initially expected. But because of that, didn't necessarily get the high profile of some of the other big projects that were going on at the time. So yeah, maybe that's something, and not something that we're necessarily great at, blowing our own trumpet or selling successes, but that's probably something to change, is how would we navigate that in the future, maybe demonstrate that value to high levels of the organisation a bit more.
I think it's a core competency most data teams need to build on as well. So look, that's awesome. Emily, Justin, thank you for your time. I want to thank all the attendees as well. We'll get the recording out as well, and with that we'll send out your Movember link as well. So hopefully, Justin, you get a bit of a spruik in the donations. But no, thank you very, very much for that today.